more detail tomorrow afternoon. But with that overview, we'll now turn to our first panel session. Cara LaPointe from Johns Hopkins University and a member of CESTI will moderate this next session. Cara?
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. Welcome everyone to our first panel in which we will discuss technology assessment models. Before we can establish an effective and enduring governance framework for emerging science, technology, and innovation, it's important that we understand the role of technology assessment. So today we will be hearing from a distinguished panel of speakers on the role of health technology assessments and governance, highlighting where these assessments have been most effective and where there have been challenges. So we are thrilled to have with us today several speakers. So first of all, we have Dr. Cinnamon Bloss, who is a professor of public health, psychiatry, and medicine, and the founding director of the Center for Empathy and Technology at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Bloss currently serves as the chair of the Novel and Exceptional Technology and Research Advisory Committee, also called Nextrack. The Nextrack is a federal advisory committee that provides recommendations to the NIH director and a public forum for the discussion of scientific, safety, and ethical issues associated with emerging biotechnologies. We're also thrilled to have Dr. Tim Persons, who's the chief scientist and managing director of the Science, Technology Assessment and Analytics team at the United States Government Accountability Office. GAO is the Oversight, Insight, and Foresight entity of the US Congress. So prior to joining the GAO, Dr. Persons served as the technical director for the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, or IARPA, and he also served within the Information Assurance Directorate at the National Security Agency. Finally, we have Dr. Pierce Millet, who is the vice president of the International Genetically Engineered Machine Foundation and a senior research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute, where he focuses on pandemic and deliberate disease and the implications of biotechnology. He spent more than a decade working on the United Nations Biological Weapons Convention, which has established strong international norms against these weapons. So thank you to all of our panelists. We're thrilled to have you here today. So what I'd like to do is Dr. Bloss, I'd love to turn it over to you to start out and give you some comments on health technology assessments.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, good morning. Thank you so much for that introduction, Cara. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to thank the committee and the National Academy of Medicine for the invitation. In 1971, biochemist Paul Berg conducted a landmark gene splicing experiment and became one of the first scientists to produce a recombinant DNA molecule. Following concerns expressed about these experiments, the first Asilomar conference was organized, and the National Academy of Sciences established a committee to study recombinant DNA technology, which brought public attention to the issues. From here, Dr. Donald Fredrickson, then director of the NIH, set in motion the formation of the NIH Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, otherwise known as the RAC, which was intended to be a public forum for safety review of proposed experiments and later gene therapy trials. For over 4 decades, the RAC has served an important function as a public forum that has facilitated scientific advancement in this area. In 2019, the Novel and Exceptional Technology and Research Advisory Committee, or the Nextrack, was formed as a re-envisioning of the RAC to focus more broadly on serving as a public forum for discussing the most challenging questions that arise from emerging biotechnology research. Importantly, the Nextrack is governed by the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which has certain standards for how advisory committees are formed. For example, members of the Nextrack are all special government employees. The committee's duty is to address scientific, safety, ethical, and social issues associated with areas of emerging biotechnology research for which the NIH requests advice or guidance. At the outset, we were given 2 charges, one to establish a framework for committee deliberation and the other to consider specific questions related to gene drive technology and biomedical research. These charges have been delivered on, and in June of 2021, the committee was given a 3rd charge focused on data science and emerging technology, and this work is currently in progress. So today, I'll very briefly describe the approaches and general findings for the first 2 working groups and sort of compare and contrast them in terms of process and the types of outputs that were produced. The first working group was charged with describing approaches to prospective identification of emerging technologies and developing a process for Nextrack deliberation. As part of the charge, the working group was also asked to identify prompts or guiding principles for when an emerging technology would benefit from further public deliberation. This working group was made up entirely of Nextrack committee members, and a report was generated in just over a year. This slide shows a set of features of biotechnologies that the working group proposed as prompts for public deliberation. Note that these 7 prompts are not meant to be all-encompassing or to serve as a checklist. In fact, the committee noted a truly novel issue could arise falling within the scope of just 1 or 2 and still be high priority for discussion. And in other cases, public discussion may not be warranted unless several are present. And then in addition, these prompts can sort of be linked to broader bioethical principles as shown here. This figure represents an overview of the proposed process for Nextrack. As shown at the top, horizon scanning actually falls under NIH's purview, which then informs their identification of the charge, which is then formally given to the Nextrack as shown in the box below. Once a charge is received, a working group of the committee is formed. The working group develops a work plan, has meetings, often hears from subject matter experts, and conducts different forms of public outreach or engagement. The group generates a report of their findings and recommendations, which is then presented back to the parent committee in a public forum where public comments are heard, considered, incorporated. If the parent committee votes to accept the report, it's then formally delivered back to NIH. I'll now turn to the other initial Nextrack working group, and the charge for this group was quite different. Instead of considering a broad question across different technologies, the charge was really to go deep on one specific emerging technology, which was that of gene drive. For those of you who may be less familiar, a gene drive is a type of genetic engineering that spreads genetic elements throughout a population much more rapidly than what you would see with typical inheritance. One application proposed is to genetically engineer insect vectors of disease, such as mosquitoes, to render them unable to transmit pathogens, such as for malaria. Because insects are released into environments and cannot be confined within geographic borders, gene drives raise a number of complicated ethical, social, safety, and policy questions. The charge was to consider the adequacy of existing biosafety guidance for contained laboratory research on gene drives, as well as to outline the conditions, if any, under which NIH could consider supporting field release of gene drive organisms. This working group was made up of both Nextrack committee members as well as 4 ad hoc members, 3 of whom served on a previous National Academies committee focused on gene drives. And also in contrast to the framework report I previously described, this report and charge took almost 2 years to generate, it's almost twice as long. This slide depicts how the report is organized, and I'm showing it here to convey how this focus on one technology meant that the working group went into much more depth on a number of specific areas, some of which related to both aspects of the charge in ways that required significant time and effort to sort of think through. Also, most of the subsections in and of themselves encompassed extensive technical detail, and the committee benefited from presentations from subject matter experts across a wide range of disciplines and sectors. Here is a very high-level sketch of some of the types of recommendations the committee made to NIH. And as you can see, highlighted in blue are our recommendations for things NIH should require of potential applications for funding. In purple are things we recommended NIH provide, such as certain types of guidance. And in red, we recommended areas of research NIH should consider supporting or prioritizing. And even at times, we included the types of mechanisms that should be used. For instance, under strategies for stakeholder engagement, section 6 on the slide, we recommended that NIH support trial planning grants using their R34 mechanism for researchers seeking support for exploring field sites. So you can see here that our recommendations are very tailored to NIH. It's sort of the point I want to make. Just briefly, I'll mention that the current ongoing Nextrack working group has been charged with defining the types of research questions that require increasing granularity and aggregation of data about individuals. As part of this, the group is charged with consulting with stakeholders to discuss and assess the implications. It's anticipated that findings will be presented to the larger Nextrack in March of 2023. So I'll begin to close now by first offering some takeaways regarding the Nextrack as a model for health technology assessment. First, based on the work produced so far, we have seen the committee be able to tackle 2 types of questions, one that was broad and pertained to a landscape of technologies, this question of, when should things come to this committee and what should be the process? The second question was to go deep on a single technology, that of gene drive. Both questions were important and relevant for NIH, but the processes were somewhat different, as were the timelines and the outputs. Second point here is that NIH has that the Nextrack has a very specific focus on making recommendations for NIH versus offering general recommendations or principles for a broader audience. With that said, I think it was interesting, though, how both types of approaches are necessary and can work hand in hand. For example, the Gene Drives Working Group benefited greatly from the 2016 National Academy's report on Gene Drive. This report did offer more general principles and provided an important foundation and kind of common language starting point for the Nextrack working group, which was then able to more specifically think through what a particular funder, in this case NIH, is to do if they're going to try to make choices about how to fund work on Gene Drive. Finally, I'll also point out that the Nextrack, kind of reimagined from the RAC, is still fairly young. And although the framework has been used as a guide to inform the work of the data science working group, it's still early days in terms of being able to evaluate the framework and identify potential gaps. And I'll wrap up now. This is my last slide by just zooming out a bit and offering some more general observations, in part based on my work on Nextrack and drawing on other work. The first is that, as has been alluded to earlier this morning, some of the biggest health challenges and the emerging technologies that may help address them do not fit well into the medical or healthcare model. Certainly gene drive technology to address vector-borne disease is an example of this, but you can also imagine this being relevant for climate change and interventions or pandemic preparedness. So in terms of assessment and governance, one issue this raises is the need to think about trade-offs between ethical principles such as autonomy and solidarity, and whether and how to be explicit about this in governance. Practically speaking, as has been mentioned, this also just means a much wider group of sectors and stakeholders. Second, I think the success of this work really does rest on effective cross-discipline and cross-sector communication and collaboration. For instance, the Nextrack committee itself, like CESTI in some ways, is multidiscipline and multi-sector, and the working groups of the committee have extensively relied on input from a very wide range of subject matter experts. But even going more upstream, we could think more about how we train people who will go on to do technology development, who may benefit from training models that emphasize multidisciplinary teamwork or even convergence disciplines. I think more integration of disciplines in early stage development could really help embed ethics, equity, social responsibility, even empathy into new technologies. Funders as governance actors could incentivize such programs or collaborations. And finally, just a last point is that while public engagement is essential, I think, to technology assessment, there are many challenges in this sphere. One is that there can be a lack of conceptual clarity about what engagement is, what the goals of engagement should be, and they're often not well specified. This makes it difficult to set benchmarks for how you know when it's been done or how you know when it's been done well or the goals have been achieved. And I think there are also a few well-defined feedback loops that offer paths for integrating engagement insights back into the process of technology development or assessment. So I'll look forward to the next session where I know we're going to dive into this a little bit more deeply. So I'll close here. Thank you for the opportunity to present. And I just want to acknowledge all of the contributors to Nextrack and other collaborators and funders. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Cinnamon. So now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Tim Persons to hear his perspective.
Great, thanks, Cara, and thanks everyone for being here today. I am honored to be with Cinnamon and Piers on this, and it's been an honor to be in CESTI. Thanks, Victor, for your leadership of this. The Keith Squared, who are both helping wrap up the CESTI meeting and then kicking off things today. I'm just going to build on a lot of what has already been discussed, so it's great to be in this particular slot following Cinnamon's excellent presentation, as well as Gary and Deborah's. But I'm going to be talking a little about GAO. For those of you who don't know, we are the oversight mechanism in supporting the U.S. Congress and even including S&T issues. And so we're well familiar in our business. I lead the team that does the technology assessment as a way of life, and I have a number of things I'll talk about here and links that I will share as we go along. The technology, of course, is fast, as you've already heard multiple speakers say. This is sort of a picture of just what a silicon architecture now looks like in computing systems back. And I still remember using a soldering iron on a 2D type thing. And so I feel old hat looking at things, and it just reminds me this is a picture of something telling me about how flexibility is so key right now when we're in an era where iPhones will come out every potentially 18 months on that cycle, as well as many other things. So the rate of change is just extraordinary. And this is what we're seeing in terms of these particular S curves coming in at the rate of change. We're just exponentiating in so many things. And at the same time, not only are our technologies individually exponentiating, the confluence of them, the synthesis of these things building upon one another, as what the Academy calls convergence, that builds upon, is actually adding to that complexity of a technology in terms of what it might mean and what it could do. And so that's the gap that we step into as we support our ongoing work day by day. I think of Deborah's swim lane in the green color era, where we really are focusing on how policy is made as well as what policy is made, and we're right in between as well, bridging that gap in terms of as policy is being made. And so we have a design process that is strongly focused with design principles, working from the problems and the policy questions backward, and expressing those particular ethical framings, those high level things that we want to achieve. What do we want to obtain through this technology? What do we want to avoid? And here's the thing: is you have to be contextually relevant in every conversation about this, because the upside and downside narrative and how to do that, A, is always present in any technology conversation, and B, has to be managed in the context of a given policy of law, of authorities, and so on. Or if there's not those things, then maybe perhaps using that soft law kind of approach that Gary was talking about, and what the CESTI was doing. So FRT is something that I'm just using as an example on this, because you have face recognition technologies covering many things. I like this photo down here in the lower right, because you can't walk a block in London without hitting dozens of cameras doing that. And there's that trade space that's happened in my sister institution, or our sister institution, the UK Parliament, generating those laws. But just even if you were to say FRT use by federal agencies and use for those things that have to do with security, you really are talking about digital identity, ranging from that all the way down to national security, defense, and so on. And that's where the contextual sophistication in these questions are very important. Each of these, you would say, would cover those issues, like making sure there's equity, making sure we're supporting autonomy, and so on. But at the same time, we're also trying to solve a particular problem. What is the problem we're trying to solve with this particular technology to help drive it into the solution that we want? We've been proud to be doing an AI in healthcare series in partnership with the National Academy of Medicine. And so one of the first studies that we put out with NAM had to do with AI and drug development, and fascinating complexity of this particular topic, from one's individual data and access to the aggregation of public health data to machine learning models to help identify functionals and things like that, and data used, or machine learning data, in terms of moving from animal models perhaps into in silico models on that, ideally ones that aren't reflecting the animal per se, but reflect the human. So lots of issues with that. And so as a result, we have been innovating ourselves to be that, as policies being made, process for us to look at how things like AI and drug development, the policy options that we need to put into in line with the lawmakers making their decisions about things, and allowing them to see the double-edged sword of things, the opportunities and the considerations. It's not saying here's what you must do and optimize on only this particular facet. It's saying these are the things, almost like knobs on a machine, that you need to kind of co-optimize to help do this. And so this is just some sampling of the policy options out of that report. We also took a case study approach. Deborah mentioned that, and in CESTI, and it's great to have case studies because they tell stories and they help drive and set that policy context and questions. And you really work from those issues, like in a vaccine development. We obviously had an existential moment with the arrival of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and we needed to have the bones, the R&D bones already in place to be able to rapidly do that, and we did with the mRNAs that we saw. And so it really also turned into not only taking that basic science, running it through clinical trials, you had to go through the necessary and proper regulatory cycling of that to make sure it's ruggedized, robust, and so on, and could scale and things like that. And so this is just a picture of what we were doing in terms of technology, talking about the development of the traditional vaccine and then the technologies that went along the way that could help out, but at various phases of this. So the question was, how can we get more and better functionals, in this case of vaccines, through the system? This was technologies that we focused on in this study to help do that. In medical delivery, a second study we did in partnership with NAM, really you look at AI, we split it into the orange, the top half of this sort of pill-shaped graphic, focusing on clinical things, and each of these wedges, even in that, again, sets a contextual sophistication to the questions that still need to hew to and with those motherhood and apple pie things that we need them to do. But they have to express themselves in their own way from a policymaking perspective, because each of these have to do with different risk. And I think we really do need to think in terms of ultimately and strategically risk management. Technology assessment, in my view, is really about holistic risk management, looking in an interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral, agile manner, and with public engagement in certain facets in the appropriate ways that I think Cinnamon spoke well to near the end of her remarks. But those are the things that you have to do, and then you can separate out and again manage risks in various areas on that. And so we did do that, and had the ability to do AI in medical services and deliver, again, a large amount of policy options, ranging from the education and human capital issues all the way over to data access and so on in today's digital world. So that's kind of what we've been doing as in terms of several examples. One of the ones that is ongoing that we also are doing, as Deborah mentioned, looking at Regen Med, we have a study looking at that, but I just wanted to show you what, and as we're going along in the process of our technology assessment work, what it looks like, which is, this is a detailed design matrix, as we call it, that lays out all of these issues and identifies those things. Who are we going to talk to? On what basis? How are we going to judge whether something fits or answers our question or not, in terms of our condition, our cause, our criteria and effect, as we run through at any GA report. So this is a detailed approach to designing a study, but again, it's a way to be able to use this mechanism to drive and answer the policy questions in the way our lawmakers need to. And so I think the future is going to be something that we just recently did in publishing an overarching artificial intelligence framework. So what the point of this chart isn't just about AI, it's about the idea of framework where, in one sense, we want to be able to put out policy options that look like this. Okay, in another sense, we want to be able to show what policy frameworks look like, so that any entity working in AI can understand not only what it is, but some of the core principles of data quality, of the governance model itself, of how you monitor, how you do performance measurement of these things. And so we see a huge future for these kind of frameworks, and I think that's what is exciting to see emergent and emerging out of CESTI and things moving forward. So then lastly, what I'll say is we are, to be able to meet that agility, as Gary and others have mentioned, we're just putting out 2-page summaries just to try and educate the public. Part of our public engagement campaign is to push things out so that it's understandable, and especially in something, we wrote this on vaccine safety, and we wanted to be able to point out in a way to say, look, We're not saying vaccines carry zero risk whatsoever, but here's sort of a picture of what disease symptoms look like not vaccinating to give the individual user an understanding of what the trade-off of the trade space is to that. And then, as always, with these simple two-page reports that you could read in usually about 5 minutes, we want to give policy context and questions for the bigger things. Lastly, I'll just say we're working on, we just recently put out a blockchain report, and that was mentioned by Gary earlier, but I'm just showing you this because we're using, this is a LinkedIn platform, digital chances to tell the story about blockchain for a title system, and where you can go through slides to tell the story of how this works and engage the public to gain feedback, as well as to educate and to inform. You look at blockchain also for digital IDs. You can look at blockchain for X, for Y, for Z, which is what we were doing in telling the stories. And really, it is a time where we need to be able to communicate much better on these things. And I think it's an exciting time, an exciting place to have this conversation. So with that, Cara, let me just turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, so much. So finally, we'd like to turn it over to Dr. Pierce Millet to hear from him. Pierce?
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen at this point in time. I am going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of the 10 years of my work across 3 different settings. I'm not sure whether you can see this at this point in time.
We could, and now it's gone away.
Let's try again.
Yep, there you go.
Perfect, thank you. So as I said, I'm going to talk about 3 areas. I'm going to take you through some of the technology assessment work that I did and was involved in whilst I was at the Biological Weapons Convention. I'm then going to talk a little bit about things that I've seen consulting for the World Health Organization, and then finally bring you up to speed on some of the things we're doing inside the International Genetically Engineered Machines Competition, IGEM. When I was in the Biological Weapons Convention Implementation Support Unit, I used to write an annual update on technical developments relevant to the convention. Now, these were very high-level reviews of key developments. This example you can see here came from the meeting of experts back in 2014, and this one happened to look at general trends, enabling and platform technologies, specific advances that might be misused, specific advances that might strengthen our defenses against misuse. But these reviews were indicative and certainly not exhaustive. They resulted from an entirely ad hoc approach to technology assessment. The advances covered were largely taken from meetings I happened to attend, or Twitter feeds I subscribed to, or in some cases, some targeted desk research. As an approach, this is better than nothing. It provided a focus for carrying out some additional technology assessment work. It was surprisingly effective at provoking a discussion. It encouraged many others to use this as a jumping off point and make their own contributions into that PwC process through either written documents or side events or other contributions as appropriate. But this approach was incredibly fragile. As far as I'm aware, the Implementation Support Unit hasn't produced anything like this since I left. So that's certainly something to bear in mind in that space. Prior to the last review conference of the Biological Weapons Convention, those are big 5-yearly meetings where they take stock of how the treaty's working more broadly. And this is just after I left the ISU. I supported this workshop run by the Inter-Academy panel to identify relevant advances and consider their implications. It brought together over 72 experts from many different fields from over 30 countries, and definitely represents a much more structured approach for technology assessment. I think it's interesting because rather than structuring this review by advances, fields like neurobiology or synthetic biology, it looked at the implications. It documented how advances impacted relevant capabilities. Some of those were connected with dealing with disease, including our understanding of disease, disease detection, diagnosis and surveillance, preventing, mitigating and treating disease, or indeed responding to, rolling back and recovering from disease. Others were connected to the pursuit of biological weapons, including development, production, stockpiling, dispersal, and delivery. And so by focusing on these applications, it was really looking at the impact of science and technology on the risk space, both in terms of how it might increase the risk and how it may actually mitigate or reduce the risk. This approach drew on the collective wisdom of a large number of relevant experts. It was useful in providing a consensus on the status of relevant fields, and the results were a good fit for the policy needs because that focus was on implications rather than on the technology. But it was an expensive thing to do. And I think, in my opinion, it worked well because there was a very clear policy objective. You know, the Biological Weapons Convention needed to know how developments in science and technology had impacted the functioning of that treaty, and this was an effort to answer that question. Nevertheless, when looking at how technology might enable a bad actor to acquire or use biological weapons, the very fact of looking at how technology could help them creates a distinct information hazard that had to be considered when communicating the results. I then helped the Inter-Academy panel and the Royal Society in an effort to develop a better technology assessment mechanism for the BWC. This report was the output from a workshop to explore a series of questions. Why does the BWC need a science advisory process? Why change the current arrangements? Who should be involved? Who should govern such a process? Who should fund it? Who should provide administrative support? What should it include? What format should it adopt? And for what audience should the output be written? How should the output of the process be structured? How will the views and opinions be sought or responded to? How can success be measured? When should the advisory group meet and how often? When during the BWC cycle should this occur? Where should the advisory process be based or meet? These questions, I think, are pretty similar to those that any group using technology assessment will have to answer. It was intended to produce a standing mechanism that would assess technology and its implications on an ongoing basis. And that's very different from the sort of batch approach provided by the IAP workshop that I talked about before. Certainly answering some of those questions that I mentioned proved difficult, and it continues to prove difficult in the BWC setting. There's certainly no consensus amongst states parties on key aspects of how this process may work, and no decision has been taken on this, even though the work that I was mentioning there was done over 7 years ago. I'm also not particularly optimistic that this year's big review conference will also move forward this issue of how to do technology assessment in the BWC setting. Following the Ebola public health emergency of international concern in West Africa, WHO began a very large piece of work on R&D to prevent future epidemics. It was a highly structured approach to identify current capabilities and possible actions to combat a set of epidemic-prone diseases that then didn't have product pipelines for medical countermeasures. Now, I mostly worked on the efforts to identify the priority diseases and was part of a team that came up with the concept of disease X. Other groups carried out disease-specific mapping of product pipelines. They also developed target product profiles to fill those gaps, and others worked on key regulatory and bioethics considerations. This model is probably the most ambitious in scope that I'm going to talk about. It's certainly focused heavily on current needs. Where are the gaps in the current structure and how we can fill them? It took into account what is needed to translate a good idea or a new technology into something that can actually be used in the real world. And you've heard a little bit about that from previous speakers. It leveraged a massive amount of expertise, both inside WHO and throughout an incredible number of partners. But as priorities shifted, in my opinion, there were insufficient resources or will to continue this approach in the longer term. We did see it being applied in terms of COVID, but I'll be interested to see whether it continues to be used in other future health emergencies. If the last example focused on the situation now, there is also value in thinking about what will happen tomorrow. I mean, you've already heard a little bit about Foresight and horizon scanning. I'm going to pick up this theme again and talk about some work here that is a structured way to think about where the current trends in technology development might take us and what that means. These sorts of approaches can also explore what interventions can help steer us towards desirable outcomes, desirable futures, and away from the undesirable. And I know with some degree of certainty that when WHO set up the Office of the Chief Scientist, they too also wanted to focus on foresight work. They set up a unit specifically to do this. And I knew that as they were standing up that unit, they drew heavily both on this committee's report as well as other expert input and to develop their own technology assessment capabilities. This is important because it helps us link tech assessment to policy interventions. This is a theme I think you've heard coming up time and time again during this panel. When I looked into this issue, there were certainly an excellent set of toolkits to help do this. And it does require dedicated resources and buy-in from senior leadership, but it doesn't need the sorts of resources at an intensive level as some of the other things that I've been talking about. I just want to stress that this is not about predicting the future. It's about identifying very early weak signals and in identifying developments that may occur and allow active rather than passive responses. So as a next step in thinking about how we use technology assessment, I want to talk a little about the shift from regulation to governance. And this is being a more holistic participatory approach, moving beyond rules to explore how we can shape how technology is being used more broadly. It involves many bottom-up approaches as well as the traditional top-down. It's about what happens in practice rather than in theory. And I certainly supported WHO in developing a governance framework for human genome editing over the last few years. And that has since been applied and used to underpin other governance frameworks, for example, more recently in responsible life science research. These governance frameworks identify a different range of challenges associated with the application of a technology. It then explores tools, institutions, processes that can play a role in shaping how the technology is used, where and when, and by whom to accomplish what. A core set of values and principles are woven throughout this work. It then uses a series of scenarios, and we've heard about this from other speakers, to illustrate how different challenges may apply in specific context and which of the values and principles come into play, and then what different groups can do with different tools and different processes to address those challenges. As we explore governance, I'm going to shift to telling you about some of the things we do in iGEM. Now, I'm hoping that this will take the discussion from a very high exploration of theory to a very practical what happens every day inside labs. iGEM is the world's largest synthetic biology competition. Last year, for example, we had about 7,000 participants in 350 plus teams from 45 plus countries from every inhabited continent. Our teams go on to publish papers, found companies, and have real world impacts. This is much more than a science competition. And we have a program which focuses our teams on considering how their work affects the world and how the world affects their work. This is a different facet of technology assessment, much less focused on what the technology itself is or what it allows, but how it fits into the real world. It certainly encompasses bioethics and elements of responsible innovation and can help explore whether assumptions that are being made are actually true. It helps shape design and engineering choices. It can be integrated throughout the project life cycles. It's one way to think about whether an application of technology is actually good for the world. iGEM also has a dedicated program to ensure teams are identifying hazards and have appropriate procedures and practices in place to manage risk. That includes risks to themselves, their colleagues, their communities, and to the environment. And we're very lucky to be able to draw upon a dedicated committee made up of experts from around the world. In practice, we use both ad hoc and more structured approaches to technology assessment. For example, each year we host a workshop dedicated to learning lessons from this year's competition, but also in identifying challenges coming over the horizon that we might need to address in the future. Our technology assessments efforts are a microcosm of any attempt to do this, certainly internationally, and we suffer from the same challenges. But we do have some advantages over more formal systems. We can simply decide to change our rules and policies. We can afford to experiment with different approaches and tools for identifying hazards and managing risks, which, by the way, makes us an excellent test bed for others wanting to try out new approaches in this space. We've also worked hard to share the lessons that we've learned, both through more candid in-person briefings like this and through peer-reviewed publications. The final thing I want to talk to you about is how we work to strengthen a culture of responsibility. A need for this is a common challenge in many of the governance discussions of which I've been part. You've already heard about our rules and policies, but I wanted to stress the emphasis we place on incentivizing our teams to work responsibly. We offer financial sponsorships for teams to work on technical challenges connected to responsibility. Teams must work on human practices if they want to win a silver or gold medal in the competition. And we also offer special prizes for excellence in both human practices and in safety and security. To support our teams in working in these areas, we provide them with dedicated hubs that link the teams to information, guidance, tools, and examples of excellence. The iGEM Academy and iGEM Universe, which provide multimedia information and training, as well as online and in-person workshops, including active learning and scenario-based training, as well as access to specialist committees made up from experts. And last but far from least, we try and make working on these issues interesting and fun. We want our teams to want to work on these issues. In conclusion, there have been many different approaches to technology assessment. Some are cheap and ad hoc, others are more structured and resource intensive. We can look at the implications of technology today, and we can look at what it may mean to the future. There are different ways to integrate technology assessment into policy processes. We can find ways to identify and fill gaps in translating technology to real-world applications, or we can identify policy interventions that steer us towards more desirable futures. But none of them are particularly effective if there is no buy-in from those making the policy. And finally, technology does not exist in a vacuum. It is part of and will depend on our societies. When assessing the implications of a technology, we need to think much more broadly. We need to think about those that will use it, those it will affect, and those who don't normally get to help shape our policies. And with that, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you, and I look forward to having a discussion after this. Thank you very much.
Great, Piers. Thank you so much. So we have so much to dive into with all of our panelists. And also I will invite the audience to put questions in the Q&A. We'll go to that too. But I'll start off with a couple questions. And first of all, as Tim pointed out, technology moves so fast. You all have given examples of where technology assessment methodologies and frameworks have worked. But how do you take into account this temporal aspect and this kind of rapid technology evolution in terms of developing those technology assessments, and then how those play into adopting those elements into governance frameworks?
So I'll just start that with Cara, just because toward the end of the talk I was showing our 2-page spotlight things. Those are but for GAO, those are considered light speed, where we can usually get those out in just 4 to 6 weeks, versus or in comparison to our standard benchmark, which is 9 to 12 months for a full study, and a broader, more strategic study like our framework and things might be even longer. So I think the idea of being able to have and have a content-centered approach to the kind of tech assessment we're doing, and then build upon that in a rapid cycle time, is the approach that we're taking in order to better track it. And at the same time, it doesn't preclude us from ever going deeper on some broader issues. Even though there is technical evolution in certain facets of things that moves very quickly, we also see that there's some very, I guess, often systemic or key risk challenges that aren't going to change regardless of the cycle time of a given technology. So it really just depends on the aperture setting, as I call it, on how narrow you're looking at a technology or broadly. But building those mechanisms to be able to move quickly is critical, because those questions are real, they do come up, and they need to be answered.
I'll also add that I think kind of building on this idea of a network and working as a community to do this work that Gary brought up this morning, I think that there can be sort of like handoffs in doing this work that could be useful. So for instance, some of the work that I was involved in with the DARPA Safe Genes program before the Nextrack was envisioned. We did some very early, I don't know if I call it technology assessment, but certainly looking at kind of some of the social and ethical issues. That was for very upstream work. And now there's been sort of a kind of a conceptual handoff in terms of thinking about that work with DARPA was not involved with actual field trials, right? But now NIH is asking this question about field trials. And so there's a different set of questions and a different set of assessments that need to be done. So I think these handoffs across networks can be useful as well.
Great. Piers, did you want to weigh in at all? I know, especially with kind of work on pandemics, those can move very fast, right? So, what are some of the lessons learned you found in kind of best practices for that rapid response?
I think in some way, to pick up what Cinnamon and Gary were probably talking about earlier, some of it's having access to the right people. In all of the cases I've seen where we've had success, we've been able to very, very quickly reach out to the folks that have aware of the technology, they're involved in developing it or using it, and have had the chance to familiarize themselves with it to a greater degree than those are looking at the policy options involved. So I think, anything we can do to build those networks, to have those connections is great. My only concern with that is it's not very scalable, right? There are not many world-class scientists going around. As we try and replicate this in more places with more settings, it's going to be harder and a greater demand on those few people that are fully cognizant of what the technology means and what it may, the implications it may have. We have to find ultimately a better way than relying on knowledge that's in a very few people's heads.
And I think that ties into something that all three of you had pointed out during your presentations, is this importance of having multidisciplinary and cross-sector collaborations, right? It's not just a technology assessment done by technologists. We have to really understand from all sectors. So, I'd love to hear from all three of you of what are the lessons learned you've seen for creating those collaboration mechanisms in a way that Pierce points out can be scalable.
I'll just start by, I think there really is that human dynamic, Cara. In using a greedy strategy, we want to be even more than multidisciplinary. We want to be interdisciplinary. We want folks to mix and to do things. And that means, frankly, just time spent on issues, whether it's workshop kind of things that work in an agile way, then break, have periods of time to soak and to think and then do it again. I think CESTI you might be smiling because you've done it, or CESTI's been doing it, that really is that interdisciplinary, I think is interdisciplinarity is necessary in order to have sort of, again, that larger picture of those things, and to, I think, as Piers pointed out, have a need to be able to scale, right? You can do things that I think has been shown with larger groups. You can have expert groups, you could have a mixture of both, and I think there's ways to do it.
Thanks, Cara, for the question. And I'll also just add to that by saying that I think I've kind of become interested in this idea of thinking about sort of how we train people to do technology development, and how people who might go on to do technology development, and how we kind of professionalize or socialize them around working across disciplines. I think, the traditional kind of university setting is very discipline oriented. And, I think there have been some efforts to, think about how to bridge those gaps, but to do that in meaningful ways, I think is really difficult. So I would say that, how to get past jargon, how to really kind of invest the time in building those relationships that can be challenging. And then I would say, kind of in the later point where projects are kind of getting off the ground, I think there's a role for funders to play in really thinking about how they structure their calls for proposals, and how they align incentives around kind of control of funding and setting goals and establishing benchmarks, and what the people on the projects that are a part of different disciplines, like what are their roles and how do they intersect. So I'll leave it at that.
I think I'm going to go out even broader and come back to what I was talking about, that human practices approach. I mean, inside iGen, we genuinely believe that good science and engineering includes responsible science and engineering, and thinking about the broader implications of what the technical work means is just and should be something that we do more of. And so some of that can be through structured education. It would be great to have more sort of spaces to think about that whilst we're training young scientists and engineers, but it can also be through incentivizing elements of that being just the things that we want to see. It's interesting that we don't have elements like that when we publish papers, or when we talk at conferences, or when we put in funding proposals. But all of those things we could do just to make it a much more normal, much more core integrated part of doing science and engineering, to think about what the broader implications are and who it affects and how we're going to engage with those communities, and make sure what we're doing is genuinely good, as opposed to making assumptions that we don't test until much too late in those product development life cycles.
And it's interesting, we've talked about a lot of different aspects to stakeholder engagement. We've talked about education, we've talked about training. So how much is the stakeholder engagement we need to do, that one way of communicating out, versus that participatory engagement in terms of listening and building that into our technology assessment processes, right? So what are some lessons learned about that listening piece, right? How we actually engage in participatory technology development?
So I can start here. Thanks for that question, Cara. I think it's such an important one. This issue, I think one of the ways I think about it is sort of, what is the role of engagement in technology assessment? And I think, and I'm looking forward to the next session on this, but I think there really is a challenge in terms of just even taking a step back and asking, and for any particular assessment or technology, what is the goal of, what's the goal of the engagement, right? And sort of like, how will it be used? Because in some ways, if you don't have that in mind, then you're sort of starting off on the wrong foot, right? So some of the buckets that I think about are sort of like, are you trying to engage to inquire from a certain audience to gather information? Are you engaging to inform or message or communicate? Or is your engagement really around, is there a mechanism for involvement, right? More kind of deep involvement in making choices about whatever it is being worked on. And so I would say that is something I think a lot about, and I think would like to see more conceptual clarity when we think about assessment projects. And then I would say the flip side of that is kind of refining what are the feedback loops for how, when you try to kind of engage at one of those three levels, how does that then feed back into, kind of your plan and your outputs for assessment? So those are some of my thoughts.
I don't want to jump into this too deeply, because I know the next panel is certainly going to pick it up. And so where I thought I might be able to add something that may be a little bit different is about the importance of integrating it throughout technology development, right? So this is a little bit different from education and engagement, more to saying the model that seems to work to us is to have this as a part of how you make technical decisions as you go through your projects. We have a very large number of strong examples of iGEM projects that, the team come up with a great idea when they're sitting around the table and they brainstorm what they'd like to do. But as soon as they start exploring the world, seeing what other people's opinions are and engaging with those communities, whether they're user groups or patient groups, they make technical choices, they make changes to their project in the design way very early on, that I wish we could replicate in more formal structured sort of efforts to develop technology, because it moves that thinking, that process, and those design choices into a holistic way, and it is about integration as opposed to engagement at the end. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
And I think that goes to another question that I think, Piers, you actually pointed out in your summary about, is it possible to assess these individual technologies in isolation, or how important is taking into account the ecosystem? And how drastically do we have to do that, right? Is it just understanding how technologies integrate with other technologies, or really understanding what the stakeholder group is going to be, the actual context of a technology deployment?
I think I'll start. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'll start and say, it's absolutely critical, Cara, the context. And as you open the aperture more, you're going to incorporate more nodes of those things, like that interconnectedness, that convergence issue. as you're looking at something. And so you really, I mean, you can narrowly focus there on a single technology in isolation that probably has some benefit, but it's usually in terms of the policy making, in terms of the things that we want to uphold in terms of the values and the virtues and things like that. It normally involves more than one thing. So I just noticed David Winikoff asked a question in there. It's just really about how do you engage with these ethical principles. And so part of my answer is really addressing that is I think the use of foresight that you've heard time and again, but doing it in a proper way. And I think really wrapping in that proper contextual storytelling. The case studies, I think, are critical. And that's how we've been able to convey the issues in a policy relevant way on and at the time needed to our lawmakers is using those stories. I think you've seen that. Deborah did some excellent work in the CESTI committee on the case studies coming out. I think those tell those stories when you look at those. And so that's the solution, I think, to help tie these things together. But you're right, you can't just look at one in isolation and expect very much.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and I agree that it's very hard to kind of look at things in isolation. I think there's sort of the technology ecosystem, which sort of includes the stage of development, as Piers pointed out earlier. Is it very upstream, or in kind of like the development portion, or field trials or clinical trials being initiated? There are different issues there. What's the application of it, and how might stakeholders or the public perceive different applications? For example, in the case of gene drives for vector-borne disease versus using it for conservation purposes. So I would say the technology carries with it an ecosystem. And then also, I think one thing I've reflected on with the Nextrack is that there's sort of an assessment, or whoever's the consumer of your assessment, there's that ecosystem as well. And so, whoever sort of you're assessing for, that will play a role as well.
So I'm gonna be the champion for individual technologies on this, I think, because I do think the work that Cinnamon was talking about, both at Nextrack and with Safe Genes previously, is a really good example of being able to do very constructive, very useful things with a simple technology. I think we saw a incredibly fast response to gene drives. I mean, the technology moved incredibly quickly. It was something like 12 months from the original sort of papers demonstrating this worked in microorganisms to an attempt to actually use it in practice in a contained setting, and that's phenomenal. And equally, in a roughly the same time frame, we had iGEM teams trying to use gene drives, and that, if we hadn't been able to focus down on just gene drives and try and come up with, well, what are we worried about? How do we help people spot when they're doing something that may move into that space we're worried about, and what tools can we use to manage those risks? I think we'd be in a lot scarier place than we were. And I think then, just to build off that, the very fact that there is something like Safe Genes that's existed, which is in my mind, a really good example of differential technology development. We could try, and we traditionally talk about slowing down technologies we're worried about, but we very rarely talk about speeding up safety technologies to manage risks in things that are important. And so I think there are some good examples, and gene drives for me would be a favorite area where focusing in a single technology is useful. Obviously, you can't do it in isolation. The question of how do we use these things, how do we use any of these advanced biotechnologies out in the real world outside of containment, phenomenally important, complicated ecosystems. But I don't want to lose the, yes, we should be focusing on individual technologies when there's a case.
So that leads me to one more question before we'll jump to some of the audience's questions is, we talked about scalability before, right? So if we're looking at technologies in particular, how generalizable and scalable are our tools of assessment, right? Are the tools themselves generalizable, or do the tools themselves even need to be tailored because of the different types of technologies that are emerging?
I think it's sort of one of those, Cara, a yes and no annoying answers to that. So I that's where I was saying how we've evolved into, and we're favoring frameworks that aren't a rigid thing to say you must do exactly this, but you want to be able to have flexible agility, extensibility, scalability, those sort of issues. And I think that you need to be able to have some sense of frameworking something and yet still the flexibility to operate within that. And so that's I don't think it's strictly one or the other in my view.
The dreaded "it depends" answer. Got it. Great. So we'll go to some of our audience questions. And as Tim already referenced, David Winikoff had put a question in here. So how do and should processes of technology assessment engage with or articulate with larger ethical principles that you might find in a general framework of ethical technology, such as the notions of justice that Deborah had put in her diagram?
So there I would really use the example of those scenarios that I mentioned in the WHO human genome editing governance framework, because there is a deliberative attempt to pull in specific scenario context. What are the issues we're worried about? How does that interact with those very high level values and principles? Which ones really come into play in that scenario? And then how do you use the tools and processes and institutions that are relevant to deal with those challenges in a way that matches the values and principles that you've identified? And for me, they were a very eloquent way to do that. So I've got that as an example of how I think it works. I'm hoping that there will be further work to implement that framework in different places, and we will have actual real world case studies that back up those theoretical scenarios. But that's to be hoped that it happens over the next year or so.
Great. Cinnamon, did you want to address this one at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to it. I mean, I think it's challenging, and I think that the work of CESTI in this area is really fascinating, and I look forward to continuing to see how that evolves. But what this reminds me of is just kind of one example when we were working on the gene drives group for the Nextrack, and thinking about issues related to kind of justice and transparency, and in relation to how one might think about site selection for a field trial. And so this led us to, think about many things, but one of the things that we recommended was this idea of using an NIH mechanism to, kind of potentially give money and support to kind of a much more sort of responsible, I would say, way of thinking about field site selection. So decoupling the funding for doing that engagement work that might lead to site selection from, a full proposal that might go forward to a field trial. So that's sort of one example where I think we tried to do that.
Great, thanks. We have another question from Charles Minicucci. So he says, especially in basic research, there can be attitudes of openness, information free flow, and exemption from responsibility for any hypothetical misapplications of research or data. While such philosophies are important to facilitate collaboration and innovation, how do you get scientists and engineers to engage realistically with potential military or industry misapplications of their work far enough in advance in the development process in order to prevent such misapplications?
I'm happy to take a stab at that one. I think, I talked a little bit about it anyway. The starting point is to make good science and engineering responsible science and engineering, and to just have that as a standard thing that we do all the time. And then, this potential misuse is only one of a multiple facets of things that we should be going to address at that point in time. I think, that there's also a long history of national academies engagement with this topic. There are multiple workshop reports and committee reports about how to build these cultures of responsibility. And it's all the usual things. There's education, there's outreach, there's incentivization, there's rules and punishment. I don't think there's anything there that's particularly sort of mind-blowingly different in this than there is in any other type of field. I do think that we are rapidly getting to the point where we'll start seeing consequences for failing to do this. The days of being able to sort of say, oh, well, we were just experimenting and we thought this was something cool to do and didn't give any thought to how other people may use it. I think that those days will be coming to a close. I think we can see a fascinating example from the real world, where with the gain of function, H5N1 gain of function research being done, ignoring all of the technical discussions. It's fascinating that those headlines prompted the discussion in the New York Times in the non-technical discussions amongst general publics, where the feeling was, what were the scientists doing? This is crazy. This is not what we wanted. Now, there are some very good reasons to do the work, but when there's a public discourse around this that sort of says, not in our name, then it becomes much more difficult to claim that there are unfettered freedoms in this space. I think it will just become more normal. We'll see more cases of this, and it will be organic as it happens.
For my part, I worry that we're not focusing enough on ethics and those. I think to build a ethics-based imaginative framework that you can take from the position of the researcher and then plausibly and realistically project into how might this be used. We used to call it red teaming, just thinking about what evil things could come of this, even though the researcher herself or himself are pursuing good, trying to think about that and then sort of tracking in an ongoing basis. I don't recall when I went through my PhD program doing a whole lot on sort of ethics training in this regard, and certainly nothing in terms of how to think in a foresight context about the potential future implications of the research.
Yeah, I would just build on that by saying, when we think about preventing misapplications of data and kind of, I think, building on what Piers was saying, I do think that, thinking about how we train and incentivize and hold people accountable who do that kind of work, it's sort of an interesting lever to consider. We often think about people professionals who work in the health sphere, they're regulated in many ways through professional licensure, professional guidelines, but we haven't traditionally thought about kind of data professionals or kind of computer science professionals as being as having those same kinds of accountabilities in the same way. So I think that could be something interesting to think about.
Yeah, and sometimes you point out kind of this accountability issue, right? So as we start to think about accountability, we're moving just beyond the technology assessments and into governance. So let me ask, how can the outputs of technology assessments be used to improve governance, to advance societal good? And what are those mechanisms we need to use to kind of take the outputs from these assessments and really embed them in the governance frameworks? Anybody maybe have an example of where they've seen that work really well in terms of the governance frameworks themselves being affected? I'd love to hear, Piers, maybe from your work with the UN, that relationship between technology assessment and then how the kind of principles and governance frameworks come out.
Yeah, I was just trying to see if I could come up with something new that I didn't already say when I was talking, and I'm probably stick to the tried and tested part here. But I think the key is buy-in, right? To any of this. If you can have the most fantastic technology assessment in the world, but if the group that is ultimately making the policy decisions aren't interested in the output, don't buy into the foresight technologies or the value of doing this in the first place, then it's not going to have an impact. And that's the reality of where we are. So I think that for me is the golden rule. But after that, it's also then a discussion about when and how you engage the policymakers in the processes. There are anecdotes of very senior people sitting in the back of very technical meetings. They can't possibly have really understood because that's not their day job. But to see the process develop, to be engaged in the process from day one, makes a huge difference. And I think the best example I can give you is again that human genome editing governance framework. For the first 2 or 3 meetings of that expert committee, the Director General of the World Health Organization sat in those meetings all day. Regardless of whatever else was happening about health in the world, he had prioritized this because it was an issue that he wanted to see what the developments was, and I'm hoping that even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, that there continues to be focus inside the organization to take advantage of these governance frameworks and to use the technology assessments that are now coming out of their own unit to do this, to influence how they work in the real world and how they're delivering programs. So there's a huge opportunity there. I think I'll keep my eye on it, but that's the best example I can give you there.
Great, thank you. And we have another question from the audience that goes back to this participatory engagement piece. So from Susan Wolf, in biomedical innovation, what role can research based in active partnership with affected populations, e.g. community-based participatory research and patient-led research, play in ongoing assessment of technologies and innovations?
So I can start there. It's a great question. I think it has a huge role to play because I think that there is a lot of work done in different kind of spheres outside of sort of official assessment, health technology assessment, right, in the area of engagement, and that all of that good work should be brought to bear on the assessments that are done. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel when you're doing some kind of technology assessment, for example, through Nextrack. We should be building on all of that work, both to continue to advance the ideas as well as for, to be good stewards of funding and, use the budgets that we have. So I think it's a really important.
And I think I may use the opportunity to get on a soapbox and highlight one of the challenges I see that is specifically in the US that I don't see elsewhere in the world, which is to do this sorts of more participatory research, to be able to interact with people in the real world is increasingly difficult inside the US, given human subjects research work and coming out of bioethics on actually interacting with people, interviewing them, being able to have that person-to-person interaction. And as far as I can see, the way it's being implemented in many research settings is not the bioethics approach of protecting the participants, but rather protecting the research institution for liability reasons. And I don't see it in teams when they're carrying out interviews, when they want to survey people. I can see what happens inside the US when they have to go to their institutions and seek permissions, and how long and complicated that is in comparison to what it takes in Europe or what it takes in Asia in equally advanced settings. The barriers to being participatory are much greater in the US than I see elsewhere. So I think that's a warning from me.
Yeah, so that, I want to kind of build on this for a second and ask specifically about underrepresented populations when it comes to vulnerable, marginalized populations, because even when we do see participatory-based research, we don't always get to those vulnerable populations. So how do we do that? Because they're going to be some of the populations that are most affected by the technologies we're talking about. How do we specifically get their voice into these processes?
I can give you a good example. Going back to the work of that WHO expert committee on human genome editing, they actually opted to hold one of their meetings in South Africa and engaged with indigenous groups within South Africa, in particularly the San people, who have a unique genetic ancestry that makes their genetic data for trials and for many advanced studies particularly valuable. And so amazingly, they as a community are incredibly aware of advancing technologies and and its implications. And they have codes of conduct for interacting with foreign researchers, and they were able to engage with the WHO process in a phenomenally constructive manner in helping to shape that governance framework and what their community would feel about it and where their priorities were. And it picks up some of the values and principles elements, because that's something that they really wanted to focus on and have integrated. And then just, I guess, finally to say that that's not always possible. They are a unique case. I'm sure there are many other underrepresented or vulnerable populations that would not be the case for. But just to show that it is possible, it can be done. And I think we should invest more time and effort in doing it and having uncomfortable and unusual conversations as part of our processes.
Thanks, Piers. Any examples, Tim or something that you can think of also in terms of kind of U.S. domestic populations, right? We have a lot of vulnerable populations here that are underrepresented. So any good lessons learned or best practices?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work, of course, on STEM education. I was just thinking one of the most sustainable ways is to recruit and invest in and try and build science and folks from those underrepresented to change the equation on them being underrepresented and starting to do that because they are the most affected. It's an exceptionally hard problem. There's a lot of work and passion on doing that, although there's still a good deal more to be done. I think, Cara, of our vaccine development reports, right? Because a lot of the vaccine, you want the vaccine to be as from an equity, from a justice perspective, you want the vaccine to be as available and to be as effective as to all of in the case of the Operation Warp Speed program, you want it to work for everyone and to represent. And it is, as you point out, the historic human subject research that's staying from decades ago. We're still feeling that. But there was hope in things that we saw in the practices to go out and to recruit the volunteers from that particular subset of the population, working through. Gary mentioned things in his technology system like religious considerations. So working with, for example, African American pastors, if we're talking about the African American community, or working in the inner cities on just trying to do that, because the goal is to work in a creative way, again, interdisciplinary, in an emotionally intelligent way, not just in the science way, like here's the science and just do it, but to understand the social science dimensions. And as I thought the question pointed out, having that community level, the community focus on that, because communities matter, and that's where people live and work and breathe. I think we'd be able to do that. So we've seen, again, like a GA report, progress has been made, more could be done. We could, as TA practitioners, bring more intentionality to that and come up with ways to do that. And I think you're hearing some good words on this panel already.
Cinnamon, did you want to weigh in at all? We're coming up to the end of our time, so
I'll just briefly add that I think, this is it's a difficult problem. I think that many really thoughtful people have been thinking about for a long time. But I do think that, and this particular idea is also very difficult, but I think that, our evaluation committees and our technology development teams should be as diverse as possible and have kind of wide representation on those actual committees and kind of, deliberative and decision-making bodies. So again, that's challenging, but I would say, as much of that diversity as upstream in the process as possible is important.
Great. Well, as we've come to the end of our time together, I just want to say, Piers, Tim, Cinnamon, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting conversation. Very excited, and so much of it leads into the next conversation that we're going to have on stakeholder engagement. I do think we're going into a break now. So I think we have 15 minutes till the next panel. So thank you, everyone, and really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Keith, it's good to see you.
Yeah, how are you? Good to see you too.
We're more likely to see each other at the National Academy Call now than on our own campus.
Just like it used to be that we ran into each other in Dulles more often than in San Francisco.
Well, that United Club is still there, I think. And I know where you sit there.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyone willing to say the magic word of when we start?
Oh, just to let you know, we are live.
I'm sure we are.
Great, thanks, Mario. Atul, welcome back. We can go ahead and get started.
Excellent.